Everyone wants to grow. That's the promise the entire self-help world runs on. Read the right books, adopt the right mindset, build the right habits, stack enough positive experiences on top of each other, and eventually you'll become the person you're supposed to be. But Carl Jung spent his entire career watching people do all of this. Doing everything right, meditating, journaling, setting goals, attending workshops, and never actually changing. Not where it counted. Not in the places that mattered. They were growing upward, while everything that actually needed their attention was buried below. And Jung realized that this wasn't a flaw in their effort. It was a flaw in the entire model of growth they'd been taught. Jung's most important lesson wasn't a technique. It wasn't a framework you could apply in 5 steps. It was a single, devastating insight that contradicted nearly everything the modern world teaches about becoming a better person. He discovered that real inner growth doesn't work by addition, it works by subtraction. You don't become whole by building yourself up. You become whole by turning toward everything inside you that you've spent your entire life running from. And the reason most people never truly transform isn't that they lack discipline or knowledge or the right teacher. It's that the direction they're moving, upward, forward, onward, is the exact opposite of where their growth actually lives. What Jung found was that the parts of you that hold the most transformative power are precisely the parts you've rejected, buried, and refused to look at. The qualities you've decided are unacceptable, the emotions you've learned to suppress, the memories you've sealed away, the truths about yourself that feel too dangerous to acknowledge. That's where your growth lives. Not in the light you keep reaching for, in the darkness you keep avoiding. And until you reverse direction, until you stop climbing and start descending, you'll keep adding layers to a self that was never real in the first place. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung considered the single most critical lesson for anyone seeking genuine inner transformation. Why almost everyone gets this wrong in ways that waste years of their lives. What actually happens when you finally stop running from yourself and turn toward what's been waiting in the dark. And why this one shift changes everything about how you relate to yourself, to others, and to the life you've been building on a foundation you've never examined. Jung arrived at this insight not through theory, but through observation that spanned decades. He kept seeing the same pattern. A patient would come in who had done tremendous work on themselves. They meditated, they read extensively, they'd been in therapy before. They spoke fluently about their issues. They had insight, awareness, vocabulary. By every external measure, they were doing the work of growth. But something wasn't shifting. There was a stuckness underneath all the progress that no amount of effort seemed to reach. A flatness. A sense that despite everything they'd accomplished on the surface, something fundamental remained unchanged. Jung started paying closer attention to what these patients avoided, not what they talked about. They'd talk about almost anything. But the way certain topics would surface and then get redirected. The way a particular emotion would flash across their face before being replaced by analysis. The way they'd approach a memory or a truth and then, almost imperceptibly, veer away from it. Every single time. Without even realizing they were doing it. What Jung realized was that these patients had become experts at a very specific kind of avoidance. They weren't avoiding growth. They were avoiding the kind of growth that would actually change them. They'd built elaborate systems of self-improvement that let them feel like they were transforming while systematically steering around the material that would require genuine transformation. They were renovating the upper floors of a house whose foundation was cracked. And no matter how beautiful the renovations looked, the structure remained unstable because nobody was willing to go into the basement. This is what Jung meant when he talked about the shadow. Not some abstract psychological concept. A living reality inside every person. The collection of everything you've decided you cannot be. Every quality you've suppressed because it wasn't acceptable. Every emotion you've learned to override. Every truth about yourself that felt too threatening to face. The shadow isn't the opposite of who you are. It's the rest of who you are. The parts that got cut off, pushed down, locked away. And Jung discovered that these rejected parts don't disappear when you ignore them. They grow stronger. They operate from underneath your awareness, shaping your choices, your relationships, your reactions, all while you believe you're making conscious, growth-oriented decisions. This is why Jung's most important lesson feels so counterintuitive. Every instinct tells you that growth means moving toward the light, becoming better, stronger, more positive, more evolved. And that feels true because it's comfortable. Adding good things to your life doesn't threaten your identity. Learning new skills doesn't require you to question who you are. Adopting a meditation practice doesn't force you to confront anything you've been hiding from. You can do all of these things and remain fundamentally unchanged, which is exactly why they're so popular. They offer the feeling of growth without the cost of it. But Jung saw through this. He recognized that genuine inner growth, the kind that actually restructures who you are from the inside, requires the opposite movement: descent instead of ascent, subtraction instead of addition, turning toward what frightens you instead of building more layers of performance on top of it. And he was blunt about why most people avoid this. Because descent hurts. Looking at what you've buried means feeling what you've been avoiding feeling. Acknowledging what you've rejected means questioning the identity you've built around that rejection. Going into the basement means admitting the foundation is cracked. And most people would rather keep renovating upstairs forever than face that truth. Jung noticed something specific about how the shadow operates that makes this even harder. The qualities you've rejected don't just sit quietly in the dark. They leak out in ways you can't see, but everyone around you can. The person who's rejected their anger doesn't stop being angry. They become passively aggressive in ways they genuinely don't recognize. The person who's suppressed their neediness doesn't stop needing. They become controlling in ways they frame as caring. The person who's denied their selfishness doesn't become selfless. They become a martyr who keeps score of every sacrifice. The shadow doesn't disappear. It disguises itself. And the disguise is always something you can't see on your own, because seeing it would mean acknowledging what you've been refusing to acknowledge. This is what makes shadow work the most important and most resisted form of inner growth. It requires you to see yourself without the filters you've spent a lifetime constructing. To recognize that the person you've been presenting to the world, the conscious, curated version of yourself, is incomplete. That the parts you've rejected are still operating, still influencing everything, still shaping your life in ways you're blind to. And that the only path to genuine wholeness runs directly through the territory you've been avoiding. Jung called this process individuation, becoming undivided, integrating the parts you've split off so that you're no longer half a person performing wholeness. But he was careful to distinguish individuation from self-improvement. Self-improvement is about becoming more of what you already value. Individuation is about becoming what you've refused to be. Self-improvement lets you keep your identity intact. Individuation requires that identity to be dismantled and rebuilt with the missing pieces included. Self-improvement feels like progress. Individuation feels like dying. Because the person you thought you were cannot survive the integration of everything you rejected. Something has to give. Something has to break. And that something is the story you've been telling yourself about who you are. This is why people resist individuation even when they desperately want to grow. They can sense what it will cost them. Not money, not time. Something much more personal. Their self-image, their narrative. The version of themselves they've worked so hard to construct and maintain. Individuation doesn't polish that version, it takes it apart. And underneath the constructed self is something raw, unfamiliar, and frightening. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's real in ways the constructed self never was. Jung observed this resistance in nearly every patient who reached this threshold. They'd been doing good work, they'd gained real insight, they understood their patterns, their wounds, their tendencies, and then they'd hit a wall. Not an intellectual wall, an existential one. The next step wasn't more understanding, it was surrender, letting go of control, allowing themselves to feel what they'd been managing, sitting with the parts of themselves they'd been explaining away. And almost everyone balked. Because the mind can handle understanding, it's feeling that terrifies people. Understanding your anger keeps you in control. Feeling your anger, really letting it move through you without managing it, means surrendering that control. And for people who survived by staying in control, that surrender feels like annihilation. But Jung found that the people who made it through this resistance, who actually went into the dark instead of just studying it from a safe distance, experienced a transformation that no amount of self-improvement could produce. They didn't become better versions of themselves. They became more complete versions, more real, more grounded, more capable of complexity. They could access anger when anger was appropriate instead of performing calm while resentment built underneath. They could acknowledge their needs instead of pretending to be self-sufficient while their relationships suffered from the pretense. They could set boundaries without guilt because they'd stopped identifying with the part of them that believed their value came from endless giving. This transformation wasn't comfortable. It was disorienting, because when you integrate what you've rejected, you lose the clean narrative you had about yourself. You can't be the purely good one anymore when you've acknowledged your capacity for cruelty. You can't be the strong one anymore when you felt the depth of your vulnerability. You can't be the healer anymore when you faced how much of your helping was about your own unmet needs. The labels dissolve, the categories collapse, and what's left is a person who's harder to define, but infinitely more real. Jung was fascinated by this paradox, that people become more themselves by accepting the parts they thought weren't them. That wholeness comes not from refining your strengths, but from reclaiming what you disowned. That the path to inner growth doesn't lead to some elevated state of perfection. It leads to a fuller, messier, more honest experience of being human. And that this honest experience is worth more than any amount of polished self-improvement because it's actually yours. Not borrowed from a book, not performing what someone told you growth looks like. Yours. Authentic. Earned through the courage to stop running and start looking. And if that descent, that willingness to look honestly at the parts of yourself you've been avoiding, is something you're ready to begin, there are 24 practical reflection exercises waiting for you in our guide, True Self-Discovery, drawn directly from the teachings of Carl Jung, each one designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, because what we're about to get into next is what happens after you finally stop climbing and start digging. One of the most important things Jung documented was what happens to relationships when someone actually does this work. Because the shadow doesn't just affect your relationship with yourself, it distorts every relationship you have. When you've rejected parts of yourself, you inevitably project those rejected parts onto other people. The anger you can't own, you see in others. The weakness you refuse to feel, you judge in others. The neediness you've suppressed, you resent in others. Projection is the shadow's primary method of making itself known, and it turns every relationship into a mirror you refuse to look into. Jung found that people who hadn't done shadow integration were constantly in conflict with others over qualities that actually belonged to them. The man who raged against dishonesty while being dishonest with himself about his own motivations. The woman who couldn't tolerate weakness in her partner while denying the depth of her own fragility. The parent who was furious at their child's selfishness while unable to see how their own unacknowledged needs had shaped the entire family system. These conflicts felt real and justified to the person experiencing them, but Jung recognized them as shadow projections. They were fighting with parts of themselves that they'd externalized onto others because looking at those parts internally was too threatening. When someone begins integrating their shadow, these projections start dissolving, and that changes relationships dramatically, but not always in the ways people expect. Some relationships deepen because the person is finally showing up as themselves instead of performing a role. But other relationships collapse, because some relationships only existed because of the performance. The friendship that depended on you being the endlessly supportive one can't survive you setting boundaries. The partnership that relied on you being the stable, undemanding one can't handle you expressing needs. The family dynamic that required you to play a specific part falls apart when you stop playing it. This is one of the hidden costs of genuine inner growth that nobody warns you about. You don't just lose illusions about yourself. You lose relationships that were built on those illusions. And that grief is profound because those relationships were real to you, even if they were built on an incomplete version of who you are. Jung observed that this grief was one of the primary reasons people stopped doing shadow work partway through. The cost of becoming whole was losing people they loved, or more accurately, losing people who loved the version of them that was never complete. But Jung also observed something remarkable in the people who kept going despite this cost. The relationships that remained after shadow integration were fundamentally different from anything they'd experienced before. Because for the first time, they were showing up as themselves, not the curated version, not the acceptable version, not the version designed to keep others comfortable, themselves. And the people who could receive that, who could love the real person rather than the performance, those relationships had a depth and authenticity that the old relationships never could have reached. This is what individuation does to your social world. It acts as a filter, not one you deliberately apply, but one that emerges naturally from becoming more real. Some people can handle your realness, most can't. And that sorting process is painful but necessary. Because a life built on authentic connection with a few people who actually know you is worth infinitely more than a life surrounded by people who love a character you've been playing. Jung also discovered something about inner growth that contradicts the modern obsession with speed and efficiency. Genuine transformation cannot be rushed. The descent into shadow material has its own timeline, and that timeline doesn't care about your goals, your deadlines, or your desire to be done with this already. Some material can be faced quickly. Other material requires years of slow, patient work, because the psyche will only reveal what it can handle at any given moment. Pushing too fast doesn't accelerate growth, it re-traumatizes. And Jung was careful to emphasize that the pace of individuation must be respected, not forced. This is why he was suspicious of any system promising rapid transformation. Weekend workshops that claim to awaken your true self. Programs that promise healing in 30 days. Methods that treat the psyche like a machine that just needs the right input. Jung recognized that the psyche is more like an ecosystem. It has its own seasons, its own rhythms, its own intelligence about what needs to happen and when. And the person seeking growth has to learn to work with that intelligence rather than overriding it with willpower and impatience. He used to talk about this with a specific metaphor. The idea that you can't force a plant to grow by pulling it upward. You can only provide the conditions and then wait. Good soil, enough water, the right light. But the growth itself happens on its own schedule. And the person who keeps pulling the plant out of the ground to check the roots isn't nurturing growth. They're preventing it. The same applies to inner work. You can create the conditions, honest self-reflection, willingness to sit with discomfort, courage to face what arises. But you can't control the pace. You have to trust the process, even when the process feels unbearably slow. This patience is itself a form of growth, because most people pursue self-improvement from a place of dissatisfaction with who they currently are. They want to grow because they believe their present self is insufficient. And that energy of insufficiency infects the entire process. They're growing from self-rejection rather than self-acceptance, trying to escape who they are rather than integrating who they are. And Jung saw this as the fundamental trap, using growth as another way to avoid yourself. Real inner growth in Jung's framework begins with acceptance, not passive resignation, active, honest acknowledgement of everything you are right now, including the parts you wish were different, including the shadow material, including the wounds, including the patterns you're ashamed of. You start with the full picture, ugly parts and all. And from that place of radical honesty, transformation becomes possible. Not because you've willed yourself into a better version, but because you've stopped resisting the version that already exists. And that non-resistance creates space for something new to emerge organically. Jung spent considerable time studying what this emergence actually looked like in people who'd done genuine shadow work. And what he found surprised even him. The people who'd integrated their shadow didn't become more spiritual in the traditional sense. They became more human, more grounded, more capable of holding contradiction. They didn't transcend their darkness, they incorporated it. And that incorporation gave them access to a kind of wisdom that's impossible to reach through light alone. He found that people who'd faced their capacity for cruelty became more genuinely compassionate. Not the performative compassion of someone who's never looked at their own darkness. Real compassion that comes from knowing, intimately, personally, what it means to be capable of harm. People who'd acknowledged their selfishness became more authentically generous. Not the generosity that keeps score, real generosity that flows freely because it's no longer compensating for something denied. People who'd felt the full weight of their grief became more capable of joy. Not the brittle joy of someone running from sadness, deep joy that can coexist with sorrow because it's not threatened by it. This is the paradox at the center of Jung's most important lesson. The qualities you most want, compassion, authenticity, strength, peace, cannot be built from the top down. They can only emerge from the bottom up, from the descent into everything you've avoided, from the integration of everything you've rejected. You don't become compassionate by practicing compassion. You become compassionate by facing your cruelty. You don't become strong by performing strength. You become strong by sitting with your vulnerability until it stops terrifying you. You don't find peace by pursuing peace. You find peace by turning toward the inner chaos you've been drowning out with distractions and self-improvement projects. Jung called this the coincidence of opposites, the recognition that psychological wholeness requires holding both poles of every quality, light and dark, strength and vulnerability, compassion and fierceness, certainty and doubt. You don't choose one over the other, you contain both. And the ability to contain both is what makes someone psychologically mature rather than merely psychologically defended. Most people mistake defensiveness for maturity. They've suppressed one pole so effectively that they appear to have transcended it. The person who never shows anger seems peaceful. The person who never expresses need seems independent. The person who never reveals doubt seems confident. But Jung recognized these as amputations, not achievements. These people haven't transcended anything. They've just gotten very good at hiding half of themselves. And the hidden half doesn't go away. It operates underground, creating patterns and problems that the person can't trace to their source because they've forgotten, or never knew, that the source is something inside them they've refused to face. This connects to something Jung observed about the nature of suffering that most people misunderstand. We're taught that suffering is something to be eliminated, that the goal of inner work is to stop hurting, that growth means reaching a state where pain no longer touches you. But Jung found exactly the opposite. The people who'd done the deepest work didn't suffer less. They suffered differently, more cleanly, without the additional layers of resistance and avoidance that turn ordinary pain into prolonged anguish. There's a difference between pain and suffering. Pain is what life delivers. Loss, disappointment, heartbreak, change. These are unavoidable. Suffering is what happens when you resist the pain, when you refuse to feel it, when you build elaborate strategies to avoid it, when you add layers of story and resistance on top of what's already difficult. Jung discovered that shadow integration doesn't eliminate pain. It eliminates the unnecessary suffering you create by fighting against your own experience. And that elimination, that ability to feel what's actually happening without adding resistance, is what people experience as inner peace. Not the peace of someone who's transcended difficulty, the peace of someone who can be present with difficulty without being destroyed by it. The peace that comes from no longer being at war with yourself, from no longer maintaining the exhausting project of keeping half your psyche hidden, from finally letting yourself be the full, complicated, contradictory person you actually are, instead of the simplified, acceptable version you've been performing. This is what Jung meant by inner growth. Not becoming a better person, becoming a whole person, not reaching some elevated state of consciousness, reaching an honest relationship with your own totality, not transcending your humanity, embracing it, all of it, with the courage to look at what's uncomfortable and the wisdom to know that looking is the only path to freedom. And the people who do this, who actually take Jung's lessons seriously and begin the descent, they discover something that makes the entire painful process worthwhile. They discover that the thing they were running from was never as terrifying as the running itself. That the shadow material they'd spent decades avoiding could be faced. That the emotions they'd been suppressing could be felt without destroying them. That the truths they'd been hiding from could be acknowledged without the annihilation they feared. The monster in the basement, when you finally go down and look at it, turns out to be a neglected part of yourself that's been waiting to be acknowledged. Not fought, not conquered, not transcended. just seen, just accepted, just brought back into the whole. And when that happens, when the rejected part is finally welcomed home, something inside you relaxes at a level so deep you didn't even know it was tense. A war you didn't know you were fighting ends. And in that ending, you find a peace that no amount of self-improvement could have manufactured. Jung spent his life trying to communicate this single truth, that you already contain everything you need, that the growth you're seeking isn't somewhere out there, it's somewhere in here, in the parts of yourself you've been refusing to visit. That the journey isn't upward toward some idealized version of yourself, it's inward toward the complete version. And the complete version includes everything, the light and the dark, the strength and the weakness, the beauty and the ugliness, all of it, yours, waiting to be claimed. He knew most people wouldn't take this path, because it asks too much, because it costs the one thing people are most reluctant to surrender, the story they've built about who they are. Because looking honestly at yourself requires a courage that no amount of external achievement can substitute for. It's the hardest thing a human being can do, harder than building a career, harder than raising children, harder than surviving loss. Because all of those things let you keep your story intact. Shadow integration demands that you let the story fall apart and trust that what remains, the real you, unedited, uncurated, unapologetic, is enough. But the people who do it, the ones who find the courage to descend, to face what they've been avoiding, to feel what they've been numbing, to see what they've been denying, those people come alive in a way that's visible, not louder, not more performative, more present, more real, more grounded in something that can't be shaken because it's not built on illusion, it's built on truth, their own truth, claimed through the only process that makes it genuinely yours, the willingness to stop running and finally look. That's Jung's most important lesson. Not a technique, not a theory, a direction. Stop climbing, start descending, stop adding, start reclaiming, stop performing growth, start facing what you've been growing around. Because everything you've been searching for out there is buried in here, in the parts of yourself you left behind, in the shadow you've been pretending doesn't exist, in the full, messy, contradictory truth of who you actually are. And if that truth is what you're ready to face, if you're done renovating the upper floors and ready to finally go into the basement, 24 reflection exercises inspired by these very teachings are waiting for you in our guide, True Self-Discovery, each one designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.